Hello everybody, Argent here with a reaction review of Goldeneye. Now as you'll notice, I'm out in the wild at the moment. People like it when I do these videos. I guess out and about it gives it a bit more variety, visually speaking. And one of the nice things about living in southern Ontario is you're never very far from a forest or a river or something. So that being said, let's just get right into Goldeneye. So this is probably the third James Bond film I saw. The first one I saw was Dr. No, and then From Russia with Love. There's no particular reason for that. Those just happened to be the Bond movies that we had on VHS back in the day. And for those of you Zoomers there, you probably don't even know what VHS is or even remember it. But I had those two on VHS, and I think Goldeneye was the third James Bond film I ever saw. As far as Bond films go, you could probably make the case that this is the best. It's certainly the best of, I don't know if you want to call it the modern films. That is like post-Roger Moore, or maybe I guess even if you want to go post-Sean Connery or something like that. But I think it is the most thematically deep and interesting. The most that's kind of a character study of Bond himself. And I think the one that kind of actually attempts to tackle political issues a bit more than the other ones. It also has fantastic action scenes. Probably the best action scenes maybe in any movie other than The Matrix. I'll tell you what, the 90s was a really good time for action movies. You have a couple of my favorite movies, action movies ever made. The Mask of Zorro, I believe The Mummy was 1999. Goldeneye. A lot of really good action films came out during the 1990s. But you have the tank chase scene. I think this is the best pre-credit scene where they're attacking the chemical weapons facility. You got all kinds of great set pieces and set design, like the statue garden in Moscow is pretty cool. This film has a lot of Sovietophilia. I don't know what you'd call it, but nostalgia for the Soviet Union is massive in this film. And when I was a kid and I watched it, I kind of became really pro-Soviet for a while and pro-Russia, just because I like the aesthetics of it. It just makes it look really cool. It's kind of funny that the movie that came after the Cold War ended would have the most Soviet aesthetics. Whether or not that's kind of trying to play to the film's themes or not is an open question. They had really good casting for this one. Pierce Brosnan, I think, is a really good choice for Bond. He kind of did it in a slightly different way. He has a bit more of a schmarmy charm to him. I don't mean that as a bad thing, I just mean that as a descriptor. Sean Connery was a lot more kind of rough, and so is Daniel Craig. And Roger Moore was kind of more slapsticky. Pierce Brosnan has kind of more of that schmarm to him. He also, I think, tries to play Bond in a somewhat PTSD way, and I think this one really summarizes it, as does The World Is Not Enough, is that Bond is kind of trying to come to grips with the post-war. I think Zonya Onatopp is probably the best probably the best evil Bond girl. Definitely, I can never pronounce her name, Famke Jensen, the actress who plays her, is very attractive. I actually saw her in real life from a distance once when I was at Fan Expo, but she looks phenomenal in this movie. They did a really good job with her clothing and makeup and stuff. And the Polish actress who plays Natalia is also absolutely stunning. To kind of have one of those awkward Argent bits of honesty, I think I saw this film when I was like 12 years old. And some of the scenes in it made me realize I was starting to go through puberty. I know that's a weird thing to say, but that sauna scene is legendary for a reason. So that's enough kind of gushing about the hot women in it. I think that, although that is kind of one of the things that I like about the Bond films, is they're like an unapologetic male power fantasy. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with movies where you got like Chad guys who like save the world, beat up bad guys, get the women. There's nothing wrong with just having a movie that's kind of fun. But like I said, this film I think is a bit thematically deeper than a lot of the other Bond movies. So what do I mean by that? Well, the thing is, this is kind of the first one that's made post-Cold War. So the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, and we're kind of left up with a question, and my friend Terrellian, who watched this with us, Serpent kind of put this. The film is very much about where do we go now? Where does Britain go? Where does the West go? Where does Russia go? What are we fighting for anymore? It kind of also, ironically enough, Austin Powers, I think, kind of did a good job of this, where number 2 says there is no world anymore, it's just corporations, and I've built the biggest corporation. And I think that's kind of the thing when we're starting to deal with the post Cold War films, is you did have international terrorists in the previous ones, but they, generally speaking, had something to do with a state actor. Be it the Soviet Union, be it Spectre is kind of like a pseudo-state. They ultimately wanted world domination. Communist China, that sort of thing. Also, you had people who wanted to take over the entire world, like Drax, like, I forget what the name of the guy is in The Spy Who Loved Me, but you had people who had relatively conventional plans. Sometimes it's even just to make money. But when you head into, like, the new era, it's like it's just about money. Ideology is not important anymore. Nationalism isn't important anymore. All that really matters is the great game that takes place on the world's stock markets. And I guess this is also kind of the case in the Metal Gear Solid games, where there's a certain nostalgia for the World War II and Cold War era. Because even if they were horrible in a lot of ways in terms of death, there was more of a purpose, there was more of an us or them. There was loyalty and that sort of thing. And you can kind of see that within the character of Valentin, because he's an ex-KGB agent who's now a Russian mobster. But he still does feel, and Bond uses this to appeal to him, a great deal of patriotism and nostalgia towards the Soviet Union. And while he very much takes part in the new capitalist economy, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but there's a certain degree of dissatisfaction, or I don't want to keep using the term, but Soviet nostalgia, to have it go back to the way it was. And in this film, it's interesting because this is the first film with the new M, where they got Dame Judi Dench to play M. I forget if the old M died or he retired or what it was exactly, but M wasn't in this movie. And once again, she's very much kind of a sign of how much things have changed. You have a female M now. She doesn't like the Cold War. She doesn't really care about it. She thinks that the 00 Force was just too violent. She's all about numbers. They call her the evil queen of numbers. And like analysts and kind of all this like behind the desk stuff. And kind of has open contempt for the kind of out in the field stuff that Bond represents. And she calls him a sexist dinosaur at the beginning. And Bond doesn't really know what to do in this post Cold War world. There's also the question of what place is there for Britain now. Now, Britain was kind of, at the start of the Bond series, Britain was still a great power. It still had its own empire and colonial ambitions. When those collapsed, it still had a purpose as being America's greatest ally during the Cold War. Now that the Cold War is over and America doesn't have an enemy anymore, they're just completely dominant and they don't really need Britain anymore. The question is, what place does it have in the world? And that's kind of something that the Brosnan films ask, and the answer is really there isn't one. And once you get to the Craig films, there's so much just like, they're really kind of nihilistic. There's no real concept of good and evil. There's no states. There's no ideology. It's just very obscure, behind the scenes kind of stuff. It's kind of like Jihad in Vampire the Masquerade, where no one can determine the motivations of the antediluvians and the Methuselahs. if anyone gets that reference. But yeah, so the film kind of explores that a fair amount. Like I said, with Soviet nostalgia, with the ex-general Kormanov, or however you pronounce his name, going into business with 006, with Valentin becoming a Russian mobster, with Bond himself not really sure what to do. Like, once again, and someone pointed this out, you have Bond walking down the streets of St. Petersburg. That's kind of surreal when you determine, I know for a lot of the old Bond movies, the Soviet Union wasn't the direct opponent, but it was theoretically the Cold War was going on. And now you have Bond strolling down the second most important city, the old imperial capital of the Soviet Union, as if nothing happened. And I guess kind of another interesting aspect, if we just go into 006, played by Sean Bean, who does a really good job. It's kind of funny in this film because there's the cliche of the Sean Bean death scene. And in this movie, there's like 3 or 4 Sean Bean death scenes. It's like they got the meme and they decided to try to make the most of the meme by just running with it. So Sean Bean, like, almost dies in this movie, like I said, like 3 or 4 times. And it's kind of ambiguous, so it's kind of funny. But his character is the descendant of, I forget what they're called, but they were Cossacks who the British government sold out during World War II. I don't entirely understand it, but the British government sold them out and sent them back to the Soviets, who proceeded to exterminate them. Trevelyan Alex 006's father killed his mother and himself and left him an orphan. And he was adopted in Britain or something. I forget the exact, but he's kind of this leftover relic of a people that doesn't exist anymore, who were used as pawns in 2 wars that don't exist anymore and that are rapidly fading from living memory. Obviously the Cold War and the World War II. And it's kind of interesting because he does give a speech at one point where it's like, remember all those dictators we toppled? Remember all that fighting? And for what? We just come home and they say the game has changed. Everything you did was completely pointless. And I think that's how a lot of people felt after the end of the Cold War. America was able to gain global supremacy as the hyperpower, with no one really able to rival them anymore. But I don't know if it really brought much in the way of prosperity or glory to the American people. It just kind of gave them, much as the case with Britain and France, a huge empire they had to manage, much of which was not particularly economically useful or productive. And like I said, throughout this movie, Bond kind of seems a bit more sad, or like I said, shell-shocked compared to some of his previous cases. You can tell he definitely has PTSD. They make frequent reference to how he just holds everyone at a distance and he doesn't let anyone get close to him. And that's the way he's lived his life up till now, and he doesn't really know what else to do. And I think, once again, that's very much, I've talked about this a number of times, how Ian Fleming kind of felt towards the end of his life, where the British Empire was dead. Everything that they had fought for in World War II basically fell apart. You had most of the Axis powers becoming communist countries. You had the British Empire completely falling apart and being reduced to a socialist hellhole. And in exchange for that, Britain had given up a generation of its best and brightest, suffered an immense financial loss in the form of land lease to the United States. And it was just a third-rate power that was a joke of the world. And even countries like Japan rightly just laughed at them. So like I said, this movie and the Brosnan movies in general don't really resolve this question to any great extent. They don't say, like, what's next for Bond. More or less, they just kind of portray him as, like I said, being a shell-shocked Cold Warrior, not sure what he's supposed to do anymore, just wandering from job to job in search of a glorious death. Which I guess is kind of depressing, and to a certain extent it lacks the sense of adventure and romance that some of the earlier movies had. But like I said, the Bond films are kind of supposed to be very topical. They're supposed to kind of embody the zeitgeist of the particular era. And I think Goldeneye does a really good job of embodying the 1990s. And maybe even the 2000s to a better extent than even the Craig films have, because you do have a resurgent Soviet nostalgia in Russia with the coming to power of Putin and the ending of kind of this anarchic free market period that you see in this film and in The World Is Not Enough. So I hope you enjoyed this review. Sorry if I'm panning a bit, but it is what it is. Nothing I can do other than, I guess, lose some weight. But I digress. God bless everybody. More reviews to come.